Hi folks, welcome to the Prepared Homestead. This is Travis. Thank you guys for stopping by and watching. If you see behind me, I've got a beautiful patch of goldenrod growing. And while it's not the topic of the video today, we're going to talk about EMPs, right? Had a listener, it was kind of funny. He made a comment saying, hey, I'd like to know about EMPs. You want to do a video on that? Well, it just happened to be one that I was working on. So that's what today's video is about. But before I get started, I wanted to talk real quick about this beautiful yellow wildflower that grows behind me. Let me see if I can get a close-up here, how well my camera will focus in on this. Probably not too well. Anyways, this is a very common flower here in the Ozarks and in many parts of the country. You'll see it growing on roadsides and then sometimes like this in little patches of field. What I wanted to say is that there's a lot of confusion over this plant. A lot of people think that this is the plant that causes summer allergies. They refer to it, sometimes they even call it ragweed, and they say that this is what causes your allergies. So you gotta, while I'm thinking of doing this, I'm trying to see if there's any ragweed growing around. I should have grabbed some of that. I don't see any ragweed. Anyways, they'll say, get rid of this stuff because it causes allergies, and it does usually leave a lot of pollen. A lot of times if you shake it, it'll leave a lot of pollen. And it's a great pollinator. If I could zoom in out there, which this camera won't do that good a job, those flowers are just covered in bees, lots of bumblebees, wasps, other types of pollinators. They're all over them, honeybees, everything. They're just loaded. Almost never is this the flower that causes your allergies. This is goldenrod, and ragweed is a plant that a lot of times grows near or in the same conditions as goldenrod, but it does not produce a bright yellow flower like this. In fact, it doesn't really produce much of a flower at all. It kind of blends in and it's gray. That's where you get your allergies, from the ragweed. This flower, goldenrod, if you drink a tea of it, it can help you with your allergies, actually. It's in a way kind of an antidote. It's good for several other things, and it's a beautiful flower, but I just wanted to point it out because I see stuff all the time, people asking, what's this flower? I'm like, oh, that's what's causing your allergies, get rid of it. This is goldenrod. It's extremely rare, really, for people to have an allergy to goldenrod. It's usually ragweed. Here in the Ozarks, we have giant ragweed and we have common ragweed. And they do grow everywhere, except apparently right here, because I don't see any. I should have grabbed, oh, I see some way back there, but I'm not going to go through that. That stuff's almost as tall as I am. Anyways, I just wanted to point that out. All right, EMPs. A lot of people are wanting to talk about EMPs and are worrying about it, and well, it may be something that we should also be concerned of. I have always said that if I was a foreign enemy that wanted to bring down any nation and to conquer it in a modern world, an EMP would probably be the best and most efficient way of doing it. An EMP would bring a nation to its knees almost instantly. Sit back and wait, and after a year or so, most of the people, at least a lot of people, would probably perish, die off, and then you move in, and all the infrastructure and everything is still in place. It's a scary and brilliant, in a way, a tool and weapon of war. And there's been a lot of talk about it, really for the last year or so. And so now, leading up to this election and with all the stuff that's going on in 2020, there's more and more talk and rumors and stuff about, well, could there be an EMP attack on top of all this? And I don't really have any inside knowledge in that. I may speculate. I do have some understanding, though, of an EMP. It was part of my training, not directly, but we did mostly nuclear training of dealing with nuclear fallout. But part of that understanding was also, and training was in what an EMP does and what it's capable of doing. So let's talk about that before we get started. Go ahead and click that like button. Sure helps out the channel, and if you would, subscribe and click the little bell next to it when you hit the subscribe button. That way you get notified of when I post a new video. Just because you subscribe doesn't mean that YouTube lets you know when there's a new video. So that's the way of doing it. And while you're at it, down below in the description I've got some links, and the first one is a website called Prepare with Travis, and it's where you can get some really great long-term food stuff, freeze-dried stuff in number 10 cans and in Mylar bags and in buckets. Amazing quality, some of the best prices per calorie on the market. If you want to click on that, it's a really good deal. And for those of you that's really focused on building up your food supply, especially long term, that's an excellent way to do it. So, why are we talking about EMPs? Well, about a year and a half ago, I guess, almost 2 years ago, I did a video on EMPs because at that time the Department of Homeland Security released some information that they had been studying, and basically it was from the Office of the President talking about how because of this study that was done, that we need to beef up our infrastructure, especially in critical essential areas of government, in case there was ever an EMP attack. And it draws some people caught the attention of some people. Sorry, gotta get my tongue untied here in a minute. And then it kind of died and fizzled away. And then recently there was another report released by the DHS, and saying that they believe that the possibility of a foreign actor, most likely China, could potentially use an EMP weapon to disable the United States and to cause great harm. We're leading up to an election, all this 2020 crazy stuff, the coronavirus. There seems to be this Cold War between the U.S. and China, and I haven't quite figured out if it's a legitimate Cold War or if it's just for all show and tell. But either way, it would be very possible for someone like them to use that against us. And they claim that they have what's called a super EMP. For years, it was almost considered a myth, or that they didn't exist. And our own government has now confirmed that a super EMP does exist. And really all it is a very large atomic nuclear weapon that is detonated up in the outer atmosphere of our planet, above our nation. And if that happens, if it's the right height and the right size of explosion, it could create an EMP blast pretty much big enough to take out most of the North American continent. If it was done precisely and accurately, it could. Smaller EMPs could take out regions or even states. The thing is that there's a lot of misinformation about EMPs also. A lot of people think that every nuke that's detonated releases an EMP, and that's not necessarily true. It typically has to be done with some altitude, detonated at some altitude. So if it was on the ground or in the ground or underwater, it doesn't necessarily mean that an EMP, or at least any EMP of significance, would happen. And then another thing is that everyone has this idea that any EMP whatsoever would fry everything, that everything would just get toasted, and it would knock us back to the Stone Age, and that one EMP could cover the entire country. Like I said, there's potentially a super EMP that possibly could. It's never been tested that way. So hypothetically, in theory, it would be big enough to cause an EMP blast, which is an electromagnetic pulse, for those of you that don't know, that would cover most of North America, at least the United States. Now, what kind of damage will an EMP do? It's a good question. And let me tell you this. If you have watched anyone or read anything of anyone that says they absolutely know, then they're not correct, because no one really knows exactly what these large EMPs would do to the United States, because, well, it's never been done. Now, of course, there's all the testing, especially the testing that was done back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s of nuke testing here in the United States and all over the world. And so we have some idea of what EMPs did then. There are natural EMPs that have occurred. And back in the 1800s, one happened, and there's been some, basically like an asteroid that might explode in the atmosphere, and it can create an EMP also. And so we know what those did. But most of the times that we have recorded in history of a natural or man-made EMP, it's either been at a time that it was pre-industrial or pre-digital, pre-electronic, or it was done over areas that weren't very heavily populated. So what would happen if a major, large, massive, super, whatever you want to call it, EMP was detonated over the United States, especially over high populated areas, and the fact that we have a lot of very digital technology. Virtually everything is run by microprocessors, and it's everything's digital. Honestly, we don't really know the results of that because it's not been done. There's certain tests that can give us ideas it's been done, and then there's, of course, a lot of speculation. Now, I've said all that not because I want you to think, it's not a big deal. I also don't want you to think that, oh my goodness, if it happens, we're all dead. What I'm saying is that we should prepare for it. We should take all the precautions that we're able to prepare for an EMP, but also know that, we don't really know. For instance, cars. A lot of people talk about that. A lot of preppers talk about, EMP-proof cars. And I've seen the standard seems to be a car that was produced pre-1987, pre-1990, depending on the make and model. Anything before that's probably pretty good and is going to work, and you may have to just turn it off, turn it back on a couple of times, and it'll kick on. I've heard people say that all the way up into the late 90s, maybe even the early 2000s, while they had computers in them, they weren't controlled enough by computers that they would be that affected. I've heard people say that, in fact, I saw this the other day, a guy said that you have to have a vehicle that's pre-1970 to be EMP proof. And I'm like, pre-1970? So you're telling me a 1972 Ford pickup's not going to be EMP proof? I think that's a little extreme. And then I've also seen people say that modern cars, the very newest cars, are actually EMP proof because there's a lot of shielding put in on these vehicles. So there's a lot of misinformation in that. And honestly, to be quite frank with you, I don't really know, and I don't think any of them truly really know the answer. What I do is try to have at least one vehicle that's just an old clunker. And not just because of an EMP. Partly is because we live out in the sticks. And having an old farm truck is cheap, and it's a good thing to have on hand for hauling dirt and rocks and feed and lumber and all that kind of stuff. And out here you can find them pretty easy and pretty cheap. So, it's a good idea to have an older vehicle. And I would say probably, anything before 1990 for the most part is going to be pretty good, 88, 87, something like that, maybe further back. What about your house? If it was a big EMP, most likely things like the cellular phone are going to be done. And I see people all the time are like, oh, you can get these little Faraday cage bags that you can put your cell phone in. Okay. By the time unless you're going to have a spare cell phone, but by the time you'd know that it would happen, it's going to be too late. So that would mean that you would have to have just a spare cell phone that you stick in a Faraday cage bag, a Faraday bag. But here's the thing. So maybe if you put it in that bag, it protects your phone. But what about the network? The network would most likely get fried also. There's a lot of things like that. And the Faraday cages, and I wish I could find it again, because the video that I did a year or so ago, year or two ago, I read part of this article, and I cannot find the article again. So I hate it when I can't find it to back up what I'm saying, because I know a lot of people think, he's just fake news. The article was a publication, a published scientific study by what's considered, I can't remember his name, sorry, had a whisker in my mouth. It's a problem with having a big beard. He's one of the world's foremost experts in EMP and possibly what could happen. He's worked for the U.S. government, and basically what he was saying in the article is that the bigger the bomb, the higher the altitude, it produces a higher frequency. And he said in the testing that they had done that most of the Faraday cage plans that's on the market and most of the little bags and stuff like that you can get to put stuff in would be inadequate if a super EMP was used, that it would still fry them. And I cannot remember the exact numbers and specs, but he was talking about simple electronics, cell phones, things like that, of what it would take to protect them from a super EMP. And I remember reading, and it was quite dramatic. I mean, he was talking about putting it in like a Faraday cage inside of a sealed metal drum and burying it like 18 inches or something for it to withstand the blast of a super EMP. He said that most of the stuff that they had studied was just not adequate. It might work against a small one, something that might affect a region or a state, but it would not protect against a big blast. So that's also something to think about. In the end, this is why I push one of the reasons why I talk about it often, is that while you should not, to be a self-sufficient prepper homesteader, you don't have to live primitively, but you should be able to. You should be able to live a non-electric kind of primitive, let's say like the Amish, or like people did in the late 1800s. You should be able to live that way and have what you need to survive. Doesn't mean you use it all the time. Like a flour mill. We have a hand crank flour mill. We don't use it all the time, but we have it. I have a lot of hand crank type of things, a lot of saws and stuff that we have oil lanterns and ways to make candles and a lot of things that are more primitive, okay, or that are at least non-electric, non-digital. Just in case, that is something that you should get to, is try to think of, and you could say, well, you have solar, you have generator and stuff. If it's a big EMP, odds are that stuff is not going to be helpful either. And then the other thing is if it happens, and I think it's very possible. I mean, if someone really wanted to depopulize the world and gain control, that would certainly be one way of doing it. I believe it was the CDC a few years ago did a study, and if a super EMP was detonated in the United States, they predicted that in the first 12 to 18 months that up to 80 to 90% of the population would die. That's big. People that are dependent upon electricity because of medical needs, the water, sanitation, food production, people just losing their mind, rioting, violence, all this kind of stuff. It would drastically take its toll. It would bring the nation to its knees in a very rapid sense. I think it would really be worse than what a lot of these movies showcase. I think of a TV show like Jericho. Good show, but I think it was a little soft on what would probably actually happen. And so, if something like that were to happen, be prepared to live pretty simple, primitive life and bug in for as long as you can. Being away from the rest of the world is going to be the safest thing in that situation, and being prepared to defend your property where you're at. These are probably some of the best ways. Being self-sufficient, being primitive, simple, old-fashioned, and just being ready to defend and take care of your own. If you can do that, you should be able to come through a major EMP fairly good. Now, what would be the long-term outcome? An invasion later on by a foreign country. I don't know. That these are all speculations, but it is something that we should be aware of and be thinking about. I think because, man, here lately, like I said, in the last couple of years, the government's been talking a lot about it. Senate hearings, DHS putting stuff out, CDC doing studies on it. They seem to be pretty concerned with it, and if they are, then we probably should be also. Let me know what you think. I know I kind of skimmed the surface because there's really a lot to talk about with EMPs, and I feel like I just barely scratched it. So let me know what you think. Who knows, we might end up doing another video on this. And I think the guineas are coming over here and going to start making a lot of noise. So I'm going to get off of here. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.